Hey guys, today I filmed an interview with a good friend of mine. We recorded this interview through a video chat program, and the video and audio quality is not as nice as it normally is, so please be understanding with that. Give me a break. I'll make sure the next one is recorded in a different way. I've got a few ideas how to make it HD, and I've got this nice microphone here. Make it all HD and high quality and everything for you. So this time it's going to be a little grainy, but next time it'll be nice. The conversation is very high quality though. I just wanted to let you know at the end of this video, there's a little announcement for how you can download a free learning material that I've produced for all of you. So watch to the end and check that out when you get there. Okay, enjoy the video. Hello everybody. So today I wanted to bring in a friend of mine, a friend of the channel, an inspiration for me when it comes to language learning, somebody who helped me keep going when I was ready to quit learning Korean, probably 4 years ago or something like that. A lot of you probably know him if you've been around this channel for a long time. I'm sure he needs very little introduction. Today's guest is Jonson.
I'm right here.
The man, the myth, the legend. So Jonson
you messed that up. You have to say that again. Legend.
Legend. Right? That kind of means something different in Korean, but
yeah. Let me give it some echo. Legend.
Perfect. It's exactly what we needed.
Excellent. Hey, how are you, Ian?
I'm excellent. I am feeling good. I'm happy, and I'm really excited to be talking about language learning with you again, not just in a podcast, but on YouTube. It's been a long time.
Excellent.
So Jonson, just in case anyone's new here, Jonson is a Korean. Well, would you like to introduce yourself? You know you better.
Sure. So I'm a native Korean speaker. So I grew up in Korea. I went to school there. I got married there. I got my first child there. So everything. And then I moved to the United States when I was 27. And then, fast forward, I started this Spongemind podcast and Spongemind TV YouTube channel about language learning, specifically about learning Korean, and for Korean people learning English, about learning English. But these two paths kind of join. They kind of meet together. Mm-hmm. And then, I got to meet Jeremy, who kind of started this channel, but this is a new channel now.
Right,
but
yeah.
So we ran the podcast together, Spongemind podcast. Also, he had his YouTube channel. I have my own YouTube channel. Basically, I am trying to inspire people rather than instruct. So that's my main purpose. Although I do teach as well, but
yeah, and you're succeeding at it for sure.
We'll see.
Well, Jonson, everyone, is, in my opinion, just a great mind when it comes to talking about the cultural gap and the linguistic gap between English and Korean. He has this really unique way of looking at things that is very easy to understand if you're listening to what he has to say. And I think what he's doing, what he just said there, inspiring instead of instructing, is encouraging a lot of people to keep going with this really difficult thing that we've chosen to do. So I want to introduce him to all of you in case you don't know who he is, because Spongemind is an excellent resource for people going either direction, Korean to English or English to Korean. Yeah, so go check it out. We'll start this with the plug, and we'll end it with the plug too.
All right.
So Jonson, the thing I wanted to talk about with you today is what I've been doing so far. And I wanted to get your opinion on it because it's more of just an idea I've been exploring than like an idea that I'm married to. So I've been working on special topics on the channel. I've been talking about why learning 사투리, or learning about 사투리 at least, is really important. And I'm also in the future going to start talking about why I think you should be learning 한자, the actual Chinese characters, not just 한자어, the vocabulary words that are Korean vocabulary. So the question I have for you, first off, is as a native speaker of Korean and a native level speaker of English who learned it, what are your thoughts on 사투리, on regional dialects of either language? Just in general.
So the first thought that comes to my mind is that I do understand Satori, most of it, although I don't speak it. I grew up in Seoul, and
Mhm.
I never lived in any other region outside of Seoul. So you can say I have never been exposed in my family, in my family background, I've never been exposed to a Satori, but yet I do understand it most of the time. So if native speakers understand it, I think you should understand it too.
Great. And what about English? What was your experience with the different ways that Americans talk?
Oh, English is a little different in that it's spoken everywhere, not just in
Right.
the United States, not just in Britain, but all around the world. For example, there's this Indian accent, there's
Right.
this Australian accent, there's this Singaporean accent. And if many people are speaking it that way, I think you should be able to understand it. It doesn't mean that you need to do Indian English immersion, Austrian English immersion, British English immersion. I don't think that's necessary. I think
Mhm.
what you need to do is just to get exposed to a lot of English, period. And then over time, you'll get naturally exposed to all these other aspects of the language, other accents, other ways to speak the language. So I
So it
think
sounds
that's
like,
what you ought to do.
yeah. Okay. So it sounds like what your opinion is here too is
Mhm.
that being open to all of them is important. Like,
Totally. Open is the keyword, open.
yeah. Yeah, that's the reason I thought this was important was
Mhm.
like doing this series on Satori and stuff like that. The reason I
Mhm.
thought this was important was because when you're learning Korean, so many people talk about like, oh, you need to learn Seoul Korean because people
Mhm.
from Gyeongsangdo sound like gangsters, and people from other parts of Korea sound like farmer, rural, that all the
Yeah.
stereotypes that
Yeah,
go
you
with
got to be
that.
careful right there, right? Because if you
Yeah.
speak of other English accents in the
Hmm.
United States, then that's not quite right, right? You could get in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, and well, yeah, that's true. But this idea of like just ignore that stuff. Just
Mm,
keep that out of your mind because it's not important. Everyone lives in Seoul. The only thing that matters is standard Korean, blah 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 blah.
mm,
And so many people I think whenever at least as a learner who's gotten to a level where I now live in Korean, like you live in
mm,
English most of the time,
mm.
um so many people can't understand any non-standard Korean. They have no
Mm.
like flexibility for things that are not from the textbook.
Right, right. But it's not
And
because
yeah.
of the absence of exposure, because
Mhm.
if you have been doing Korean immersion for a long time, for some time, I'm sure you have been exposed to some 경상도 사투리, 전라도 사투리, etc. But
Mhm.
I think the reason why you understand almost none of it is because you have been rejecting it.
Mm.
You've
Mm.
already decided that it's useless. It's not
Right.
useful. Satori is not useful for me. I gotta learn standard. I mean, I don't know what this word even means. Standard, right? But I
Exactly.
gotta
Yeah.
learn this standard Seoul Korean,
Mhm.
right? So therefore, uh, I think this decision is made subconsciously. But therefore, I'm gonna reject all the other things about Korean that are not the standard Seoul dialect.
Yeah.
And that's a huge mistake. And the reason is because if you start building a filter like this, then you have to constantly figure out what's useful and what's not useful, right?
Mhm.
And your brain is already spending a lot of energy on learning the language itself. Now your brain has to do this second task, which is very hard, to
Mhm.
differentiate between saturi and non-saturi, between something useful and something not useful. But as a learner, it's very hard to tell. Each time you hear a syllable, a word or utterance, you have to constantly differentiate between the two. And I think that's a waste of energy. So
Yeah.
I would say do not have such a filter. It creates mental block. Do not have any kind of filter at all. Just stay wide open all the time and don't think
Mhm.
about usefulness. That's my tip.
Yeah, I mean, any language from actually not even just native speakers, but any piece of information in the language that you're
Mhm.
studying is valuable, you know, like context building for how the language works.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it, that you're like double filtering everything.
Of course. Yeah. You are doing extra work if you do
Yeah,
that.
what a waste of energy.
Yeah,
So
it is.
stop doing that, everybody. Open
Yeah.
your hearts to
Doesn't matter.
Saturi.
If the native speakers understand it, I think you should understand it too, eventually.
Right.
So stay wide
Eventually.
open. If some Koreans, I kind of use this example when you have this private conversation. Let's say, hypothetically, many Koreans are using this Arabic word. I don't know any Arabic word Koreans commonly use, but let's say there's such a word, then you should learn that Arabic word too. Although it's not Korean, you don't want to tell yourself, oh, it's not Korean, it's Arabic. So I don't want to learn that. But
Exactly. Yeah.
Koreans somehow picked it up. So you should pick it up too.
Yeah, and I have an issue with that. Not disagreement, but I have an issue with that as a native English speaker. Whenever I run into Konglish, like I feel sometimes closed to this incorrect usage of words that I already know. I'm like, no, that's not what that means. And
right. Like
you know,
tension. You know how
exactly.
Korean people use the word tension, right?
Tension. Yeah. Like your good vibes, your like
I know it's
happiness,
exciting, right?
excitedness. Yeah.
But tension is used usually negatively in English. So
Yeah,
yeah,
almost only negatively,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
And yeah, and like, you know, sometimes I think people get this idea like, well, I'm good at my native language and I'm not going to make this mistake. I'm doing air
Mm,
quotes
mm,
here.
mm,
But that's what the word means. And, when so to take a small tangent, the first
mm,
foreign language I ever studied was French. And I
mm.
learned very quickly how much of English is just incorrect usage of French words. How so sometimes as an English speaker learning Korean, I feel it's not as intense, but I'm like, oh, this must be how French people feel when they listen to English. It's like,
But who defines correct? I think the users who define correct. If
right.
Koreans start using the word tension, not tension, but tension,
Tension.
as
Yeah.
Korean people would pronounce it, and let's say they start using it in a positive context, in a positive way, right? Oh, this is so exciting, right? Whoa, my blood is like rushing because I'm so excited. Then it is what it is. No one can say it's a wrong use of the word because a lot of people are already using it that way.
Yeah, and definitions change over time anyway. And some of these words, kongrishi or the waseiego, the Japanese ones, some of them have actually come back and become English words. So like the word salaryman, that is now a word we use in English in like standard, not standard, but in the native speaker community in the Anglosphere. But that word was actually made in Japan to talk about a certain type of office worker. So sometimes they're innovative and useful, and they always come back.
Right.
So maybe tension will mean something else someday.
Sure. So going back to our topic, right?
Yeah.
Saturi. So no one can say so certain intonation, certain, I guess, inflection of the language, Korean language, is more wrong than the standard Korean. I think that's a wrong statement. That's an incorrect statement. If a lot of people, because I know a lot more people are speaking in Saturi than standard Korean in Korea, in South Korea, right? If you combine 전라도 사투리, people who speak 전라도 사투리, people who speak 경상도 사투리, people who speak 충청도 사투리, if you combine all these people together, that's a larger number of people than people who only speak like me.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who's to say, one way to speak Korean language is wrong and the other way is right?
Yeah, I agree.
No one can make such a statement.
So that's a great transition to the second question here I've got for you. As a speaker of the Seoul dialect of Korean, what are your what do you know? What are your thoughts on 경상도 사투리? Just in broad strokes.
It's an integral part of Korean language, and a lot of my friends, Korean friends, speak 경상도 사투리, and I have no problem understanding them. So, I mean, it's a very natural part of the language. So that's my thought on it, and I don't have any impression over it. I don't really see it in a positive way, negative way. It's just another side of the language for me. So it's very natural.
Yeah.
For me to hear 경상도 사투리, 전라도 사투리.
I read a study, a linguistic study, where they asked a bunch of people, like their thoughts on saturi. Like they had them draw pictures on a map of who speaks what way, and it was very kind of feelings based, not numbers based. and then they put all those maps together, and they kind of made a gradient from one from one region to another.
Mhm.
And what most people said was the most different, the most exotic sounding Korean was
Mhm.
this Gyeongsangdo dialect.
Mm.
And so I was
Mm.
wondering, like, do you feel that like people from most of the country more or less sound like they're from, like they speak Pyeongjuno, but then there's this one region that's like really different. Does that match up with your experience as a native speaker?
Yeah, because I had this experience, right? So I was in college, and my sisters are pretty young, much younger than me, because they were, the age gap is quite big. So when I was in college, they were quite young, I guess,
Mhm.
in elementary school years. So I wanted to give them a tour. So I took them to the Yonsei University, where I went to, and then we walked around the campus, and I ran
Mhm.
into one of my friends who was from Daegu area. So Daegu
Mhm.
is another big city in Gyeongsangdo area, and he had this heavy Daegu accent, right?
Mhm.
But I had no trouble understanding him because I'm used to it, right? So we just talked, where are you going? What are you up to these days? Blah, blah, blah. So we talked for a good 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we said bye. And then one of my sisters just talked me on the shirt. 오빠, I'm going to speak Korean here. 오빠, 아까 그 사람 왜 외국말 해? So, why was he speaking a foreign language? So
Mhm.
my sisters did not understand what he was saying. They thought he was speaking a foreign language. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I've heard that before, that like
yeah.
the the initial impression of the way people sound here is like they're either speaking, I hear Chinese a lot, like they're like it sounds
Mhm.
like Chinese because
Mhm.
of the kind of sing-song nature.
Intonation. Mhm.
Yeah, the intonation.
Mhm.
Or also they say it sounds like Japanese because of how similar it
Ah.
is to,
Mm.
there's a lot of similarities between this and the like Kansai dialect of
Right,
Japanese,
right.
the Osaka
Mhm.
dialect.
I will agree
So,
with that. Yeah.
yeah,
Sometimes 경상도 사투리 sounds a little bit like Japanese.
interesting, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that story. That's really funny.
Yeah.
저 사람 왜 외국말해?
Right. But it doesn't mean that they had any negative opinion about that accent, right? They were just not familiar with it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I would say if somebody is speaking a very heavy saturi, heavy accent, then I would have to strain a little more. I would have to focus a little more, but not too much. And that's what happened when I came to the United States, because we have tons of people who are speaking um, English in a different way, right? So,
Right.
for example, in California, there are a lot of Indian people here
Hmm.
who came from India, and they speak English differently, with
Right.
different intonation. And at first, it was really hard for me to understand them, but now I'm used to it, and I can understand them just fine. So,
That's great. Yeah.
yeah,
So that I think that really that really describes like the point I was trying to make is you don't have to use one. You don't necessarily have to use a saturi,
right,
but you have to be able to understand all the different ways people speak. I think the
right.
Indian English example is perfect because there's so many, native speakers of English, more or
Mhm.
less,
Right.
who pronounce English that way and use all
Hmm.
that different grammar and vocabulary that they use in the different regions of India. It's not like
Hmm.
one thing, but that's an interesting I
Right.
never thought about it that way, but you're
And let's
right.
say, as an English learner, your plan is to live in India, right? Let's say
Hmm.
I want to work there, I want to, have the great experiences there. Then you might as well pick up the Indian accent rather than American accent, because
It's
American
true.
way of speaking English is also an accent, right? Because English
Mhm.
didn't come from the United States. So
It's true. Yeah.
so using the same logic, if your plan is just to live in Korea, especially in another area, an area other than Seoul, let's say you pick one of the Gyeongsangdo cities, you might as well start speaking Gyeongsangdo 사투리. It would help you even more than learning standard Korean,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some, famous like foreigner TV personalities who have learned a specific saturi by living in some region of Korea for however long, and
Mhm.
that's kind of their like their thing. When they go on TV, they're like, "Oh, it's that foreigner
Right.
that talks like he's from, Busan or whatever."
Hmm.
So, I wanted to ask you this question as well,
Mm.
as my third and final question here. So, in um in English, it can be occasionally seen as offensive to use a dialect of the language that's not your native dialect, more or less.
Cultural appropriation, right?
Sometimes it can be cultural appropriation. I think that happens a lot with like African American vernacular English, which is the linguistic name for like the black dialect of English. But it also happens with like rural and southern dialects. We see it as offensive for me to start talking like this and making fun of the way people from small towns talk. It can be offensive. It can also be offensive to make fun of, like even just using the dialect at all can be seen as an intrusion into that culture. There's some reasons for that. Like in English, I think one's dialect carries a lot of identification information and has
and history.
History. It has political connotations, things like that. In Korean, do you think that that's the same case? Like using elements of a saturi in your speech can be seen as offensive by any group or seen
I don't
as
think
weird?
so at all, because Korea has a different history than the United States in regards to. I wouldn't say we didn't have like regionalism. I wouldn't say we didn't have any kind of discrimination against certain regions, because it did happen, but among Korean people only.
Right.
It didn't happen between immigrants and Korea. I mean, that's wrong, because we also have discrimination against outsiders as well in Korea. But what I'm saying is that based on the dialect, what am I trying to say here? So let me, before you delve into a non-Korean person speaking a dialect or saturi, let me tell you a little bit about Jeollado area, because I know this is a fact that Jeollado region historically has been discriminated against by the regime, the military regime that happened. And I've actually heard some adults talking negatively about the people from the region as well, right? People that I was very close to, very old people. And I didn't think much of them. I was, at that time, I was too young to understand why they were, saying things like that. And, I was totally disregarding their opinions, because I was young and they're old people, they make no sense. Yeah. But let's say because you sometimes speak in Gyeongsangdo Saturi, right?
Right. Sometimes.
And I'm like 99% sure that Korean people would have no problem with that, because we have no history. We have very little history of non-Korean people speaking Korean. It's that history is really short, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have either positive or negative opinion or I guess emotional experience about that. So I would say Koreans would have no opinion of that. In fact, they would have some opinion. It would be positive. Like they would be much more impressed if you were speaking 경상도 사투리 or 경상도 사투리, 전라도 사투리 instead of the standard Seoul Korean, because these days people hear non-Korean people speaking the Seoul standard Korean quite often. It's very easy. You can just turn on TV or turn on YouTube, and there you have it. White guy or black guy speaking the pretty fluent Korean in Seoul standard accent. But very rarely do they hear they very rarely they hear somebody like you or somebody who doesn't look like Korean speaking in dialect, in Saturi. So that sounds really impressive and authentic. I think that's the keyword here. They sound really authentic. Oh, he sounds very regional. That's authentic.
Yeah, that's great. That's been my experience. So I'm glad to hear that, because my experience too, when I have great opportunities to practice Korean without having to be a foreigner. What I mean is, like, if I like play an online game or if I'm on the phone, I get a really great opportunity to not have to be a foreign person speaking Korean. I don't get looked at that way. Or when I get in a taxi, when I have sunglasses on, sometimes they're driving and they go, oh, 우리나라 사람 아니네, or I get something like that later. But
later,
when I found that more often than "Are you a foreigner?" I get "오, 사투리 잘 쓰네" or something like that, right? 와, 경상도 사람이 들어와 있네, something like that. Whenever I do the voice chat, because I can hide my imperfections with the interesting nature of the dialect,
Right. And
because
no one has ever told you that, how dare you to like mock the Gyeongsangdo people, right? No one
that's
has
true.
ever said that.
I've never heard anything like that before.
Right. Right.
But I would in English if if I said certain things certain ways, I would be like, you don't do that. People would say,
Right. Right. Yeah. I
that's
mean,
not
the
cool.
US has a long history of immigration.
Yeah.
And I mean, Korea has also discrimination historically and now, but relatively new. I think one of the best parts of learning a new language is to obtain the sense of belonging. Oh, I not only belong to the community I came from, I belong to that community of these new people, this new culture. That sense of belonging is wonderful. And that's one of the most exciting parts of learning a new language.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee that if you speak in a certain dialect of Korean, you'd get the sense of community, sense of belonging much more easily than when you speak in the standard Seoul dialect.
Yeah, it's a
I
great way to
guarantee it.
like add yourself to, it's like a big Venn diagram of identities of being
Right.
Korean and being from this region, being
Mhm.
this age group. And you can't join all of those as an immigrant.
Mhm.
I'm not
Right.
ethnically Korean. People will
Mhm.
never see me and think I'm Korean.
Mm.
But when they hear me, I can
Mhm.
join some in groups. And I think that's been a really big benefit to my motivation and
Mhm.
just general mental health while living here. We talked about this on your podcast when I did that
Mhm.
with you.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for answering those questions.
No problem.
I've got a billion more questions for you, but I think we'll end this one here today. As we're wrapping this up, I hope this was really helpful for all of you. If you want to get a lot more help on inspiration and motivation and bridging the cultural gap between English and Korean and the mental gap, like the way how you think about learning language and stuff like that, I highly recommend everything that Jonson has worked on the internet. Would you like to share your places that you publish
Sure,
things?
sure. So you can use any kind of podcast app. It can be iTunes. These days they call it Apple Podcast, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah,
Apple
or
Podcasts, yeah.
Google Podcast,
Mhm.
or I don't know, Stitchers.
Stitcher, yeah.
Yeah, Stitcher, and what
Are you
else?
on Spotify?
Spotify as well.
Great.
Pandora. So
Mhm.
anything that is a major podcast app, you can find Spongemind podcast as well. So go ahead, search for it and listen to some of the episodes. You might like them. So
Great. I do.
that's great. And I certainly do. That's Spongemind podcast, and on YouTube I have Spongemind TV. That's my YouTube channel, and I have a lot of Korean lessons too. But I guess it's slightly in a different way. And you will see what I mean if you check out some of my videos too. I also teach how to learn as well.
Very
So
well.
yeah,
Yes.
thank you. So I think it's going to help you become better learners of Korean. So that's
Yeah.
another huge chunk of my YouTube channel content.
Yeah, if I can throw in a recommendation for all of you when you jump into SpongeMind, I highly recommend the Sponge Loops series.
Mm.
So all the podcasts are excellent. If you have time to sit down and listen to a podcast, I recommend every episode. But the Sponge Loop series are really innovative and really accessible when you don't have a lot of time. And I think you'll end up listening to all of them just sitting there. But they're short clips of native speaker audio in either English or Korean that have they have transcripts and translations and all kinds of stuff that are really well made. But also you have this opportunity to just immerse for a few minutes. And that's just amazing. No one's doing anything like that. And so that's why SpongeMind is the best.
Oh, shoot. I forgot to mention this too. So can I talk about my language learning camp or
Please
language
do.
training camp?
Yeah.
So I'm running this program. I have been running this program called language training camp for quite some time. I think I had about over 200 people so far who participated in it. So it combines the people who are learning Korean, like you guys, and Koreans learning English together. And I pair them up one on one through a language exchange, and there is a guided language exchange. So whenever there's an issue, I troubleshoot, and I provide the structure and system for the language exchange to go smoother. So based on the people's levels, and I pair them up very carefully too. So that's part of it. And also I give people weekly missions. So this is mostly about listening and reading. I mean, you gotta build a foundation in order to have conversations, right? You cannot just, pull something out of no inventory. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the programs that I'm running too. So if you are interested, you can, go to spongemind.org, and check it out. There's my video introducing what the program is about. So language training camp.
Great. So everyone go to, excuse me. Great. So everybody go to spongemind.org. Check out what's going on there with the language training camp. Check out the Spongemind podcast and YouTube channel, and stick with it. That's what we want you to do. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate everything you've done, and of course, also just coming by today. Hopefully we can do this again soon.
All right. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Hey, just a quick announcement for everybody. We have launched our Korean Patch website. You can find it at koreanpatch.co, koreanpatch.co. Through the website, I'm offering a free download. It's a guide to persistent grammar puzzles in Korean. So these are pieces of grammar that are very fundamental, things you see very commonly from the very beginning of learning Korean, but they're extremely hard to understand if you're a native English speaker. The way to download this guide is by joining our mailing list. It's really easy. It's free. It's going to be the way that we let everyone know in the future about the courses and other, downloadable materials that we're going to develop for Korean learners who are really serious. And it's just going to be the easiest way to get all of the newest updates on what's going on with Korean Patch. So just head over to our website, join the mailing list, get that download, and let me know what you think. I'll see you over there.